I've caught myself doing something strange more times than I'd like to admit. It usually happened late at night when the apartment was quiet and my phone screen lit up with an old photo that some app insisted I should revisit. I would stare at the image for a few seconds, smile without meaning to, and immediately think I missed the person standing beside me in that picture. For years I believed that feeling without questioning it. I told friends that some people never really leave your heart, and they nodded because everyone likes a story about unforgettable love. The truth was much messier. Looking back now, I can see that I wasn't longing for the relationship nearly as much as I was longing for the version of myself that existed while I was inside it. When we first met, everything felt unusually easy. We could spend hours talking about nothing important at all, wandering through grocery stores without buying much, sitting in parked cars after dinner because neither of us wanted to go home yet. She laughed at jokes before I even reached the punchline, because she already knew where my mind was going. I convinced myself that kind of connection was rare enough to overlook everything else. So when little disagreements started appearing, I filed them away as temporary problems. Then they became weekly arguments. A misunderstanding about dinner somehow turned into a debate about respect. A delayed text message became evidence that one of us didn't care enough. We had a habit of taking ordinary disappointments and stretching them until they filled entire weekends. I remember one evening when we spent nearly 3 hours sitting across from each other in silence after saying things that neither of us could take back. The food on the table had gone cold. Outside the window, people walked by laughing with friends, while we stared at opposite walls, both too stubborn to apologize first. The next morning, we acted as if nothing had happened, and because we were good at pretending, I started believing the pretending myself. The relationship continued like that for longer than it should have. We had unforgettable highs and exhausting lows, and I kept telling myself the highs proved the lows were worth surviving. After it ended, everyone asked if I was okay. I always answered yes, because saying no invited conversations I didn't want to have. The reality was that I barely slept. I replayed old conversations, while brushing my teeth, while driving, while waiting in line for coffee. I became an expert at editing memories. Without realizing it, I removed every uncomfortable scene from the story and left only the highlights. I remembered the road trips, but forgot the arguments that happened halfway there. I remembered the way she reached for my hand, but erased the nights she refused to speak to me. I remembered feeling understood, but forgot the countless moments when I felt completely alone while sitting right beside her. It happened so gradually that I never noticed I was rewriting history. Every visit to the past polished another rough edge until the relationship looked almost perfect. Friends who knew us better would occasionally remind me of reality. One of them once laughed and asked if I had forgotten calling him at 2 a.m. because we had another fight. I laughed too, but inside I realized I honestly had forgotten. My memory had quietly replaced those moments with something softer. I carried that idealized version for years. Then one afternoon while cleaning a closet, I found an old notebook where I used to dump my thoughts after arguments. I sat on the floor, reading pages I barely remembered writing. There were entries describing sleepless nights, canceled plans, conversations that left me questioning my own judgment, and promises to myself that I would stop accepting behavior that made me unhappy. The handwriting was mine, but it felt like reading someone else's journal. I closed the notebook and stared at the wall for a long time, because it didn't match the story I had been telling myself. If the relationship had really been as magical as I remembered, why had I written page after page begging myself to hold on to my own peace? I put the notebook away, but the question stayed with me. Months later I unexpectedly saw her again. There was no dramatic music, no sudden rush of emotion, no cinematic reunion. We simply ended up in the same place and started talking, because pretending not to recognize each other would have been stranger. She looked familiar, but also different in subtle ways that time creates. We exchanged polite updates about work, family, and life. She smiled, I smiled back, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I noticed something surprising. The ache I thought I carried for years wasn't there. I kept waiting for it to appear, but it never did. Instead, I felt like I was speaking to someone I had once known well, and had naturally grown apart from. Driving home afterward, I realized the person I had been missing didn't exist anymore, if she ever had. The woman I had carried in my imagination was assembled from isolated moments, carefully selected highlights, and wishful editing. She had become a character rather than a human being. The encounter didn't break my heart because the illusion had quietly dissolved the moment reality stood in front of it. Yet even after recognizing that, I still felt an odd emptiness that I couldn't explain. It took much longer to understand what remained. Around that same time, I looked through old messages from friends. They joked about how energetic I used to be, how I always suggested spontaneous late-night drives, or convinced everyone to try new restaurants. I barely recognized that version of myself. During the relationship, I had been more expressive, more impulsive, more willing to risk embarrassment. I planned surprises, wrote long notes, and believed almost every weekend could become a memory worth keeping. After the breakup, I slowly stopped doing those things. Not because someone told me to stop, but because the person who enjoyed them seemed to disappear with the relationship itself. That realization hit harder than seeing her ever could. I wasn't mourning the loss of another person as much as I was mourning the disappearance of an earlier version of myself. I wanted back the optimism, the openness, the willingness to care without calculating the cost. For years, I mistakenly attached all of those qualities to her presence, assuming she had created them. In reality, they had always belonged to me. She had simply been there when they surfaced. Once I began to see that difference, small changes started happening. I accepted invitations instead of making excuses. I traveled alone for a weekend and found myself laughing with strangers over dinner. I stayed up late talking with friends and realized I could still lose track of time in conversation without recreating the past. One evening I caught myself making a ridiculous joke that made an entire table laugh, and afterward I remembered she used to enjoy that exact kind of humor. Instead of feeling sad, I noticed something almost comforting. The joke hadn't belonged to the relationship, it had belonged to me all along. More memories returned over the following months. I remembered the beautiful mornings and the painful nights together instead of separating them. I could finally admit that we loved each other sincerely, while also acknowledging that we repeatedly hurt each other in ways neither of us knew how to fix. The relationship was neither a perfect romance ruined by circumstance, nor a complete mistake from the beginning. It was simply two imperfect people trying hard and still failing to become what the other needed. Accepting that complexity felt strangely peaceful. I stopped checking old photos because they no longer seemed to contain hidden answers. They became what they had always been, snapshots of moments, not evidence that the entire story had been wonderful. Sometimes I still think about those years, but now the memories arrive with balance instead of distortion. I remember laughter echoing through empty streets after midnight, and also the silence that followed pointless arguments. I remember feeling deeply connected and deeply exhausted, often within the same week. Most importantly, I remember that the hopeful, vulnerable person I believed I had lost never actually vanished. He had simply withdrawn for a while after getting hurt. The longer I lived beyond that chapter, the clearer it became that I hadn't been chasing another person at all. I had been chasing a reflection of myself preserved inside an old memory, convinced it could only exist in the company of someone else. The quiet relief that eventually replaced the longing didn't come from forgetting the relationship or pretending it meant nothing. It came from recognizing that the best parts I thought I had left behind were never locked inside another human being. They were waiting patiently for me to reclaim them. and once I finally did, the story I had spent years romanticizing became lighter to carry because it no longer felt like the place where I had left the best version of myself.